Hello everybody. I just want to talk a little bit in this video about the Posner Cueing task. And so this is a task that you're going to be using for your assignment number 4. And so I want to just provide you with a little background, especially because there were a chunk of students that weren't able to make it on the last class period where we talked about this. Now, before I start talking about the Posner Cueing task, I want to remind you of the idea, or at least one of the ideas that we talked about when it came to attention, and that was the idea of attention is basically a spotlight. So what I mean when I say that attention can act like a spotlight, is basically we can do two things. We can move it around spatially, so we talked about that and how we do that whenever we were doing the Where's Waldo task, and when we were talking about overt and covert attention. So you can basically move your attention around in space. But the other thing we can do with attention is that we can make it either really, really wide or really, really narrow. Much like you can do with a spotlight, where you can change basically the size of the spotlight or how much area that spotlight is lighting. And so keep that in mind as we talk about the Posner Cueing task. So, in order to talk about Posner Cueing, I want to set up the idea of something called spatial attention. And basically the idea with whenever we use the term spatial attention, we're talking about the ability to focus on a particular position in space and to be prepared for a stimulus to appear in that location. And that's basically what the Posner Cueing task is doing. So in order to do this, what Posner did is he presented participants with a couple different types of trials. And so here we have one trial type that's listed, and here we have another trial type that's listed. And then I'll talk about a third one that I don't have an image for here. But basically what Posner did is he presented participants with either one of 3 different trial types. And so one of them is called the valid trial. So in this valid trial, participants would look at the screen and they'd see this fixation cross. And basically this fixation cross just told them, okay, go ahead and direct your attention to the center of the screen. And then eventually what would happen is 2 boxes would pop up. And one of those boxes was basically highlighted. So here we see that the leftmost box is highlighted. In the case of the valid trial, this is what we would refer to as the cue. And the cue suggested, okay, what's going to happen is eventually there's going to be a target that pops up, and when that target pops up, it's going to appear in the leftmost box. And so that's why it's called the valid trial, right? The cue is a valid predictor of where the target's going to appear. So this isn't just a reaction time task where once the target popped up, what participant will have to do is press the appropriate button. In this case, let's say it's the S key. They would have to press the S key to mark that that the target was on the left side box or the left-hand box. So as we've talked about this before, this is going to be a choice reaction time task, right? So that was the case of the valid trial. In the case of the invalid trial, a similar thing would happen. The main thing, though, is that when the cue appeared, the cue would actually direct them to the wrong box. So in this case, the cue is saying, okay, when the target appears, it's going to appear in the leftmost box. And then what we see is that the target actually appears in the rightmost box. So this is going to be an invalid trial. Now, the type of trial that I don't have pictured here is going to be a control condition. And basically what would happen is that no cue would appear whatsoever, and you would just get the basic choice reaction time if you didn't give them a cue, regardless of whether it was valid or invalid. So that's the Posner Cueing task, and those are the 3 different types of trials that show up in it. Now, one of the things that Posner did is he paid very close attention to manipulating the percentage of time that cues were either valid or invalid. And so he specifically came up, at least for the example that we're talking about here, with an 80-20 ratio. So 80% of the time the cues were valid, and 20% of the time the cues were invalid. And then, as I said, the neutral cues, which would be no cue at all, would also pop up. Now, one of the things I want you to think about is why is the percentage of trials that are either valid or invalid important? And in order to kind of get you to think about that a little bit, what I want you to think about if you were to treat these cues as a friend who tells lies whenever they're telling a story. I know it's controversial, but we all do have that friend that allows a fair amount of lies to slip in. So if you had a friend that told the truth 80% of the time, and told lies 20% of the time, how much would you trust that person? Chances are pretty good that you trust them a fair amount, right? Most of the time that they were telling you the truth. This is important in the Posner Cueing task because this is the same thing that's happening to participants. They're saying, okay, 80% of the time I can trust the cue, so I'm going to keep using that cue in order to be able to try and react as fast as possible whenever the target appears. Now, what would happen, and I actually asked this on the assignment, but what would happen if the valid to invalid cue ratio was 50-50? What that means is that 50% of the time, the cue would be not, or would be invalid, so it would be telling you the wrong direction. In that particular case, what do you think that the participant would do? Or to put that another way, if you had a friend that only told you the truth 50% of the time, how much would you trust what it is that your friend's saying, and how might that affect performance on this particular task? So that's a little food for thought as you think about one of the questions on the assignment. But basically what I want you to do is to take a second and think about what you would think reaction times would be in this case. Would reaction times be faster for the valid trial as opposed to the invalid trial? Or would it be the opposite? Or would reaction times look the same across? So go ahead, take a quick second to think about that. Well, here's actually what we find. So basically, if we have the no expectation neutral cue, or in other words, if we have the control condition, it usually takes people on average of about 270 milliseconds in order to be able to correctly recognize which box the target appeared in. Now, what ends up happening though is that when the cue is valid and it shows up in the valid condition, this actually shows kind of a benefit of knowing where that target is going to appear, right? And so we see that reaction times get about 20 milliseconds faster. So really small amount of time, but still significant, that basically knowing where the target's going to appear, having a valid cue, is going to improve performance so the participants are faster on this task at identifying the box that the target's on. Now, what ends up happening is that in the case of the cue being invalid, or the target not showing up where participants are, probably not that surprising, reaction times are actually longer. And so one of the ideas of why this is the case is that because people have kind of set up the cue to shift their attention to one particular box, and then eventually when the target doesn't appear in that box, what they have to do is they then have to shift their attention to the other box to see if the target's in there and then press the appropriate button. So this benefit of a valid cue is known as just basically benefits. And then there are costs of not knowing where. And these costs are the longer reaction time that it takes when you've kind of been tricked into looking at the wrong box. And it makes your reaction time much slower in that particular case. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions or anything about the Posner Cueing task, but I think that that's enough to get you kind of started to thinking about assignment number 4. So, per usual, drop me an email. Feel free to use Blackboard if you have any questions about assignment number 4 in the Posner Cueing task. And yeah, good luck out there.